So as we continue the path of loss, the next thing that we need to lose is imagination. Now, that sounds a bit dry and boring, and I don't mean that you need to lose your creativity or your capacity to invent things. What I mean is that we need to stop confusing imagination with reality. We need to know what's true and what's imagined. Now, I have a pretty simple, concrete definition of what's real and what's imagined. And I'm pretty strict about it, so be warned. But what's real to me is what I can prove and demonstrate and observe right now. And anything else is imagination. So from my point of view as I speak, what happened earlier today is imagination. What happened yesterday is imagination. What I've got planned for tomorrow is imagination. My opinion about events and people is imagination. All of this really is made up in that it only exists in my head and possibly in the heads of other people. So if the whole human race was wiped out in 5 seconds' time, there would be no trace of that. Now, most of what we concern ourselves with through our waking hours is imagination. It's stories about what happened and what might happen. And it's opinions about what should or shouldn't happen. Now, one of the imaginings that I get hooked on time and time again is that people around me should behave in certain ways, that they should get along, that they shouldn't argue, that they shouldn't fight. And when they do, then this massive resistance arises that leads me away from this path of awareness and onto this path of thinking and trying to control the world around me. Now, I had an experience of this recently where my children were fighting and arguing, and half an hour later I was still annoyed about them fighting and arguing, and this thought that they shouldn't argue, they should get along. And I noticed in that moment, I looked up and I noticed that my son was reading a book and my daughter was playing with her other brother, and actually the argument was only taking place in my imagination. And it struck me also that in that moment I could not even prove that they had ever argued. If I looked upon what was observable in that instant, it was that they were getting along perfectly well. But in my story of fighting and arguing, I was fighting and arguing with what? With a picture in my head, with something totally imagined in that moment. And this is what each of us is doing most of the day, is imagining things, and we call them memories, but we're mentally regurgitating sights and sounds, and then other words are arising that contradict those sights and sounds or agree with them. That was bad, that was good, that should have, that shouldn't have, and so on. This is what we're doing most of the day. Now, when we step onto this path of loss, we've got the option to stop paying so much attention to imagination and to recognize it as imagination. Because when you know that something is just imagination, it's just a picture in your head, then you can quickly and easily disregard it and move attention back to this observing presence, to this witnessing. You've spent your whole life lost in that imagination, and you can spend the rest of your life lost in it if you want to. If reincarnation exists, then you can probably spend 100 million lives lost in those stories and those pictures. The question is, are you ready to give up this nonsense that's been ruining your whole life, and to start to embrace actual reality, which is what you can see, hear, touch, and feel right now without a label added on top of it. So today I want to invite you to just play with this, to just test this process of disregarding imagination, of noticing it as imagination and returning attention to reality as it is. This is a really nice little experiment that we can do. Very powerful. So take a minute now to do your written reflections. Make sure you run some tests on this imagination thing today. See if I'm onto something. And re-listen to this if you need to. And stick with it. Because as these precious habits start to drop away, your true self, your true radiance is starting to come forward, even if you don't notice it yet.